Hi, this is Ken Johnson for another episode of SecCast. This tutorial is part of our Ruby on Rails secure coding series centered around OWASP's top 10 list. Today's tutorial will cover missing function level access control and how it can occur in Rails applications. In Rails, access control is most often handled by filters at the controller level. This is the primary point of this category of vulnerability, to find and remediate functions that are missing access control. We'll discuss weaknesses in implementation, auditing your application, and when to use a whitelist versus blacklist approach on your filters. Let's get started. Our first example of an access control issue is very simple and straightforward. This is an example of a complete lack of access controls. In order to demonstrate this weakness, we'll need to first authenticate. Once authenticated, let's copy the URL so that we can directly browse to the dashboard. Next, we log out of the application. We'll paste the URL into our browser. If correctly configured, we should be redirected to the login page because we do not have a valid session. As you can see, this application has not protected this resource. Not a huge deal as of right now. There really isn't anything sensitive in this particular action. The point is that other actions or functions could be added and code changes over time, so something small like this could become a bigger issue later. We'll show an example of when it becomes a larger problem farther along in this tutorial. Let's take a look at how this happened. While viewing the dashboard controller, we can see a skip before filter declaration, and the filter we are skipping enforces user authentication. Obviously, if we are skipping the check for user authentication throughout this entire controller, a controller intended specifically for authenticated users, we've already introduced a problem. Commenting this out and attempting to forcefully browse to the function causes a redirection back to the login, now that that authentication filter is applied. And that authentication filter is applied at the application controller level. So it's applied to the entire controller. To clarify for those who are unfamiliar, the authenticated filter is once again applied at the application controller level, and this is the most common way of doing it. All other controllers will inherit from the application controller, so the filter is just automatically applied via that inheritance. This is common in Rails applications. The next standard test we'll run is checking filters in terms of not just authentication, but higher privileged access. To do this, we'll first authenticate as an admin. Next, we'll copy the URL that represents a function that should require administrative privileges. Now we need to log out. Let's authenticate with a non-administrative account and browse to that same URL again. You can see that with a lower privileged account, we can still access administrative functionality. This is a problem. Let's fiddle with the parameter in the URL to see if anything comes of it. We'll change it to the number 2. By doing that, we are redirected back to the user's dashboard. Let's investigate why. You can see that in the administrative controller, we have a filter named administrative with a conditional function. So if the admin param returns false, a user will be required to undergo the administrative before filter check. Let's look at the admin param method. You can see that this will return true if the admin parameter passed is anything other than the number 1. This explains why changing it to number 2 caused a redirection. When you look at the administrative filter, you can see that it checks if the current user object, which is based on an authenticated session, and whether or not the current user object has admin permissions. If they do not, the user is redirected. There really wasn't a good reason to allow a bypass of the filter based on user supplied input. Avoid this type of logic. We also notice within the administrative controller that the get user action is skipped by the before filter using the except declaration. Let's look at what this is used for. It appears that this action returns a partial with user information based on the user supplied input and doesn't require administrative privileges as the check is completely bypassed. This is dangerous and should allow us to harvest user information. We'll navigate to the URL that brings us to this endpoint. As you can see, user information is returned, so this is helpful from a username or email harvesting standpoint. Auditing application filters could help avoid these types of issues. There are a couple things you want to do in order to find these types of issues. As I mentioned before, you'll want to audit your application's filters and where as well as how they are applied. So here, we want to audit anywhere in the codebase where we are skipping these before filters. We can see that the dashboard controller is skipping the authenticated filter and that it does not have an alternative filter to rely upon for authentication, such as a filter that checks for a header token, as an example. Let's take a look at the mobile controller. You can see that it also skips the authenticated filter. However, it applies a filter called mobile request. When you review the mobile request method, it checks for a parameter or checks the user agent, but it doesn't deter someone who is not authenticated and who may not have permissions from interaction with these methods. In order to show proof of the issue as well as demonstrate impact, let's show what happens when we browse to this URL. First, let's clear our cookies. This way we are not authenticated as anyone to the application. We want to have the user model class returned in JSON format, so we'll add a parameter called class and type in user. The action calls classify.constantize on the class parameter, so we should be good to pull this attack off. As you can see, the application did not prevent us from viewing sensitive information about users, from their passwords to their authentication tokens and other sensitive personal information. Besides applying a filter or applying it insecurely, let's talk about approach. When skipping a filter, I recommend to use an only approach so that only the methods you exclusively annotate as being allowed to skip the filter are. If we were to try and use the except method, we are essentially blacklisting versus whitelisting which actions can skip important security filters. The opposite is true with before filters. Use except if you'd like to skip the filter since, again, the filter is applied everywhere except where specifically and purposefully skipped. Filters should be treated with caution, and this approach is an easy rule of thumb to use in order to produce code that is safe not just in the moment, but over time as more code is added. To recap, we've discussed and demonstrated missing or insecure function level access control and discussed defensive measures. Make sure to audit your filters and be cautious when applying filters using a whitelist approach. I'm Ken Johnson. This has been another episode of SecCast. Thanks for watching.